You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, where we do fast, fun, free daily deep dives into books of the Bible. And right now, we're going through Esther.
Do you remember when Daniel LaRusso wanted to get good at karate because the bullies were beating him up at school? And so he went to the neighbor guy in the apartment complex and he was like, hey, it seems like you know karate. Will you teach me karate? And then the neighbor guy was like, yep, show up at dawn. I'll teach you karate or whatnot. And instead of teaching him karate, he just made him do chores. He made him wax things and sand things and paint things. And you're like, this bunch of bullcrap. That's not karate at all. And then later on, after all of the waxing and sanding and painting, Mr. Miyagi's like, all right, let's do this thing. And he goes to punch Daniel, and then he just yells chores. And every time he yells a chore, Daniel just knows what to do. Boom, and he just blocks stuff. Hyper realistic. That's actually how you learn karate. Likewise, in the same way Daniel LaRusso was able to immediately transfer all of his hard-earned chore knowledge into karate masterhood, so we are about to do the same and become masters of the book of this analogy is not holding up at all, but I'm just sticking with it. The point is we've been putting in a lot of work, and today I wanted to look at some of the big points of that work that I think are going to pay off in terms of our understanding of the book of Esther as we move that direction. Payoff number one. We've learned a lot about how the Jews got to Persia and how they found themselves in the situation they found themselves in the book of Esther. And that's going to help us understand this big, grand narrative and set of pressures that this now divided people group is up against, because some of them went home to rebuild things. We read about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, some of which covers things that happened before Esther, some of which covers stuff that happens after Esther. So all of those pressures, all of those ethnic identity questions, all of those how separated should we be as a religious people questions, all of that is front and center in the minds of Jewish people back in Jerusalem and in Persia at this time. And so I suppose that is wax on, wax off number one. Wax on, wax off number two is the reality that this is a divided people group. A bunch of people read the prophecies and they understood how big a deal it was to go home when they had the opportunity. I mean, for crying out loud, prophets came along. Prophets who are in the Bible and have Bible books named after them came along and were like, go. You're supposed to go back, build, fix the stuff. This is really important, not just to the fate of us, but to the fate of humanity. Do the thing. But some people were like, yeah, but Persia is super nice. They have sculptures of bulls and lions eating things. There might even be some indoor plumbing around here. I mean, I'm probably not going to get to use it, but maybe someday, if I got lucky, I could try out indoor plumbing. And they were probably pretty pumped about the whole thing, and it was hard to imagine going back to a burned-out wasteland. So there's going to be some resentment that probably exists during the time of Esther between Jewish people who responded to the opportunities differently, and also the Jewish people are going to be in a more vulnerable position in some ways because they are divided. They're divided ideologically, and they're divided geographically by a very wide distance. There's an old saying, it's divide and conquer, and the bad guy of the book of Esther seems keen on exploiting that weakness for his own benefit, his own evil ends. Wax on, wax off number three, though, is that the Jews have sort of bumbled and accidented, at least from a secular perspective, their way into having the protection of the king. Their fate has somehow become intertwined with the ongoing fate and stability of the Achaemenid Empire, because they're the most prominent group of people who Cyrus, right from the beginning, let go. I mean, Cyrus becomes king of all of this stuff in 539, and he lets the Jews go back and start rebuilding in 538. And then Darius, who we've talked so much about in terms of his precarious hold on power in the early going and the goofy way in which he came to power, Darius is totally beholden to anything and everything that Cyrus did, especially big, grand displays of benevolence and nobility. And the funny thing we learn in the book of Ezra is that Darius didn't even really know or remember that Cyrus had done it, but He was so beholden to Cyrus's earlier decisions that he had a search made of all the archives, and they found the record of Cyrus's decree that the Jews could go back and rebuild in Ecbatana. And then Darius issues a very strongly worded letter saying that he is not only going to uphold that, but this is the very important clause for what we get into in the book of Esther. He adds in Ezra 6:11 at the end of his little letter, "Furthermore, I decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled from his house, and he is to be lifted up and impaled on it. And for this crime, his house is to be made a pile of rubble. May God, who has caused his name to dwell there, overthrow any king or people who lifts a hand to change this decree or to destroy this temple of Jerusalem. I, Darius, have decreed it. Let it be carried out with diligence." Look what he just did. Like father, like son, Xerxes and Darius both tend to make these big, brash proclamations about how everything is going to be that are very binding. And as a result of that, the Jews have an edict of protection. The king has declared that anybody who messes with these people is messing with the king and deserves a horrible, terrible fate. That is going to come into play in the book of Esther. Wax on, wax off, number 4. The nature of the punishment. Furthermore, decree that if anyone changes this edict, a beam is to be pulled from his house, and he is to be lifted up and impaled upon it. Well, look, I don't want to ruin Esther for those of you who maybe haven't read it, but there's a bad guy in it. Let's just say that his name rhymes with Glayman, and he decides that he wants to kill a certain people group. Let's just say it's someone whose name rhymes with the Schmooze. And then when he tries to do it, it backfires on him, and he ends up getting impaled or hung on his own thing that he made, which seems to be in fulfillment of the punishment that was outlined here by Darius. Whether that was intentional or an accident, there it is, right there, and that's going to come into play. And I suppose what's also going to come into play here is the further punishment for his entire household, which in this case is going to be the age-old enemy of this hypothetical people group, a people group whose name rhymes with the Schmlagagites. I don't think that whole awesome payoff that we get at the end of Esther is going to happen unless Cyrus is king, then Darius is king, then Darius tries to do what Cyrus wants, then Darius writes this brash big letter declaring what these punishments are going to look like. Wax on, wax off that makes us instant Esther Karate Masters number 5 is this whole deal that we read about in Herodotus, where Darius made a deal. Darius, the father of Xerxes, made a deal with all of his co-conspirators when he became king to say, you all get to approach me whenever you want, unless I'm quote unquote with a woman. And then one of those guys, Intiphernes, abuses that in Darius's opinion, and he, out of paranoia, doubles down hard on this nobody can approach the king unless summoned deal. And we learn that the punishment for getting that wrong, if the king doesn't like your approach, is very significant. If there had not been threats to the throne, if Darius had not come to power the way he did, this would not be an issue, but instead it is, and it factors very heavily into the book of Esther. Instant Esther Karate Master Wax on, Wax off feature number 6. Is it because of the way Darius came to power and how he handed things off to Xerxes? The king doesn't just get to change decrees. If you do that, some other king could come along and undercut the entire Achaemenid line, the entire Darian claim to power. And Darius even enshrined this in the closing lines of that Behustan inscription that I read to you a few days back. It's literally set in stone on a mountain for everybody to see, Mount Rushmore style, to say, don't come and mess with the decrees of the predecessor. That's a game for fools. You can't just go changing stuff all the time. And that also comes into play very heavily in the narrative of the book of Esther. Wax on, wax off thing number 7 is what we've been talking about for the last few days, and that is the insecurity and manipulatability of these kings, particularly Xerxes, who had all of the baggage of the tenuousness of how his dad came to power, but also he's got even more baggage because he wasn't the oldest son, and it took a power play from his mom, Atassa, and from some deposed king of Sparta, of all people, to get him bumped to the front of the line to become king himself. As a result, the biblical record in Esther and all of the extra biblical records paint a picture of a Xerxes who is very manipulatable and imagines himself to be a real boy and very in charge, but often is not. Wax on, wax off thing number 8, as we discussed yesterday, the looming tension out west with the Greeks factored heavily. It was the equivalent of when David was on his deathbed and he's like, hey, Solomon, my son who's about to become king, take revenge on all these people, finish them off, don't trust them, they were awful. Well, Darius kind of hands off that burden to Xerxes as well in the case of the Greeks. After being manipulated into taking action at all, Xerxes makes a grand show of what happens to people who mess with the king of lands, the king of kings, except it doesn't go very well and he comes away looking pretty dumb, even though he probably tried to declare victory. It really wasn't a victory. That incident happens right in the middle of the book of Esther in all likelihood, and it's going to factor the Xerxes we see beforehand and the Xerxes we see afterwards. And finally, wax on, wax off thing number 9. We looked at that temple dedication in the middle of the book of Ezra. We compared it with how the dedication of the first temple went hundreds of years earlier, Solomon's temple, where God showed up and fire consumed offerings, and it was clear the visible presence of God occupied the temple, but no such thing happens in Ezra. So as a result, during the time of Esther, there is a question there about where the presence of God lives. How should God's followers live when his presence isn't immediately obvious? What about when we don't hear his name or see him do things? What do you do? That would have been a massively pressing question for the Jews in Persia and in Jerusalem at this time. And the fact that the name of God is not present at all in the book of Esther is reflective of the fact that this book is meant to wrestle with that question as well, and to proclaim, even when you don't hear his name or see his presence, God is still a greater king and the more sovereign king than even the great and lavish supposed human king of kings who can't even beat the pesky Greeks. There you have it. Does it feel like I just threw a bunch of punches at you and then yelled out chores and you were able to block them all? I genuinely believe you're going to win the Esther version of the All Valley tournament. And all joking aside, I'm incredibly grateful that you've put in this extra time on the front end with me to really set ourselves up to understand this book in the fullness of its context as best as we can. I know this is going to feel a little bit weird and a little bit jarring for you to hear, but tomorrow we're going to look at the book of Esther. Oh, weird. All right, I'm Matt. This is a 10-minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.